At 6:42 a.m., the ranger station phone began to ring. It wasn't unusual for early calls to come in during peak hiking season in the Great Smoky Mountains. June always brought visitors who underestimated the terrain, twisted ankles, missed turns, the occasional overnight rescue. Most of the time, the calls were routine. This one wasn't. A man on the other end of the line spoke quickly, his voice tight with panic. He said his daughters had not returned from a day hike. He had waited through the night. He had driven the park roads himself at dawn. Their car was still where they'd left it. Rachel and Alexa McCarthy were missing. Before we begin, if you're drawn to real cases that were never truly solved, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. Now let's go back to the very day everything started. Rachel was 26. Alexa was 24. They weren't twins, but most people assumed they were. Same height. Same dark hair cut just past the shoulders. Same narrow noses and pale green eyes. Growing up, they'd learned to laugh when teachers confused their names or strangers asked if they shared a birthday. They didn't correct people anymore. It was easier that way. They had driven into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park the previous morning, June 14, 2010, planning what was supposed to be a simple hike. Nothing extreme. No backcountry permits. No overnight gear. Just a well-marked trail they'd found in a guidebook, one they'd circled weeks earlier while sitting at their kitchen table. Rachel had just finished a brutal stretch at work. Alexa had been pushing her sister to get outside more, to breathe air that didn't smell like asphalt and office coffee. The mountains were familiar to them, something they associated with childhood road trips and family photos taken beside overlook signs. They told their parents they'd be back before dark. At 7:15 a.m., park rangers reached the trailhead parking lot. The McCarthy sisters' car sat exactly where their father said it would be. Doors locked. No signs of damage. No broken glass. No notes tucked under the windshield wiper. Inside the car were 2 empty water bottles and a folded paper map with one trail highlighted in yellow marker. Search protocols kicked in immediately. By mid-morning, uniformed rangers were sweeping the first mile of trail. By noon, local police had joined them. By evening, volunteer search and rescue teams were being organized, their headlamps bobbing through the trees as darkness crept in. The terrain worked against them. The Smokies were thick, humid, and deceptive. Dense forest swallowed sound. Steep drop-offs hid just beyond brush lines. Every year, people stepped a few feet off trail and vanished from sight within seconds. At first, investigators believed this would be one of those cases. They found footprints consistent with 2 women near a muddy section of the trail, about half a mile in. The prints overlapped and wandered slightly, as if the sisters had stopped to talk, maybe take a photo. Further up, a broken tree branch suggested someone had leaned against it. Nothing alarming. Nothing that screamed danger. But there was also nothing beyond that. No backpacks. No dropped phones. No scraps of clothing snagged on thorns. No blood. No sign that anyone had fallen, slipped, or been dragged. By the 3rd day, helicopters were circling overhead. Thermal imaging scanned the forest canopy. Dogs worked the trails, then worked them again in reverse. Divers searched nearby streams and river bends where the current slowed. Still nothing. The media arrived on day 4. Local stations first, then national outlets. Photos of Rachel and Alexa filled screens across the country. 2 smiling women standing shoulder to shoulder, arms linked, sunlight catching in their hair. Headlines called it a mysterious disappearance. Commentators speculated about injury, about wildlife, about the unforgiving nature of the mountains. Their parents stood in front of cameras and begged for information. "If anyone saw them," their mother said, voice shaking, "if anyone spoke to them, please. Anything." Tips poured in. Hundreds of them. A couple claimed they'd passed two women matching their description near a scenic overlook. A truck driver thought he'd seen them at a roadside gas station just outside the park boundary, asking for directions. Another witness insisted he'd shared a trail bench with them late in the afternoon. None of the accounts lined up. Cell phone records offered little help. Both phones had last pinged off the same tower just after noon on the day of the hike. The signal cut abruptly. Not gradually. Not as if they'd wandered deeper into a dead zone. It was as though someone had flipped a switch. By the end of the second week, officials quietly changed the language they were using. The sisters were no longer described as lost. They were missing under suspicious circumstances. That shift mattered. Search teams widened their grid. They checked abandoned structures, old service roads, areas far beyond the marked trail system. Investigators began knocking on doors in nearby towns, asking residents if they'd seen two women hitchhiking or asking for help. Again, nothing solid. A month passed. Then 2. Then 6. The forest gave up no answers. By the one-year anniversary, the case had gone cold in all but name. The official investigation remained open, but the active searches stopped. Rachel and Alexa's photos faded from nightly news rotations, replaced by newer tragedies. But for their family, time did not soften anything. Their father replayed the same questions every day. Why that trail? Why that morning? Why no trace at all? Their mother kept their childhood bedroom doors closed, as if the sisters might return and need their space intact. And somewhere, unseen and unnamed, the truth stayed buried. What no one realized, not then, not for years, was that the mountains had never been the real crime scene at all. And the man responsible had already been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the world to stop looking. In the months after Rachel and Alexa McCarthy vanished, investigators clung to the mountains as if the answers had to be there. It was the only explanation that made sense. Every statistic pointed in that direction. Hikers went missing in national parks every year. Some were found days later, injured but alive. Others weren't found at all. The terrain swallowed people whole, and the Great Smoky Mountains were especially unforgiving. Dense forests, sudden weather shifts, hundreds of miles of interconnected trails. So detectives kept looking uphill, deeper into the woods, convinced the sisters had simply stepped too far off the path. But there were details that refused to fit. Rachel was meticulous. Friends described her as someone who triple-checked directions and always told someone where she was going. Alexa, the more spontaneous of the two, still carried a small notebook in her backpack where she wrote down trail names and mile markers. Neither of them would have wandered aimlessly without at least attempting to retrace their steps. And yet, not a single personal item had surfaced. Not a shoe. Not a torn strap. Not even a candy wrapper. The first break, or what appeared to be one, came 8 months later. A hiker contacted authorities claiming he discovered a blue scarf near an unmarked offshoot trail roughly 2 miles from where the sisters were last seen. The scarf was photographed, bagged, and rushed to the lab. Rachel's mother identified it immediately. She'd bought it for her daughter years earlier during a winter trip. For a brief moment, hope flared. Search teams flooded the area again, combing the ravine and the slopes beyond it. They found nothing else. No footprints. No blood. No signs of a struggle. The scarf looked almost deliberately placed, lying flat atop a rock, clean despite weeks of rain. It raised a new possibility, one investigators were hesitant to voice publicly. Someone might be staging the scene. Over the next 2 years, more items surfaced. A hiking boot discovered near a service road. A torn map fragment pinned beneath a log. Each piece was confirmed to belong to one of the sisters. Each find reignited searches that ended the same way they always did. With nothing. Privately, detectives began to argue. Some believed the sisters had encountered foul play in the park, an opportunistic predator who knew how to vanish. Others suggested they may have accepted help from the wrong person after leaving the trail. A third theory proposed they'd never finished the hike at all. That last idea gained traction when a park employee came forward with a memory he hadn't thought important at the time. He remembered seeing 2 young women standing near the park exit around mid-afternoon on the day they disappeared. They appeared to be talking to a man beside an older model sedan. The employee couldn't recall the man's face, only that he seemed friendly, gesturing toward the road as if giving directions. No license plate. No clear description. Just another almost. Law enforcement canvassed nearby gas stations, convenience stores, and diners. Surveillance footage had already been overwritten. Receipts were gone. The trail was cold again. By 2012, the McCarthy case had been reduced to a thick binder on a shelf. Then, in April 2013, everything changed. Construction crews were demolishing an abandoned gas station less than 10 miles from the park's southern boundary. The building had been shuttered for years, its windows boarded up, its pumps removed. Locals knew it as an eyesore, a relic from a time when that stretch of road saw more traffic. As jackhammers broke through the concrete floor of the attached garage, workers noticed something unusual. The concrete beneath the slab was uneven. When they dug deeper, the smell hit first. It was unmistakable. Police arrived within minutes. The site was sealed off. Forensic teams worked in silence as they carefully uncovered what lay beneath the floor. 2 bodies, wrapped tightly in blue tarps. They were positioned side by side, knees drawn toward their chests, as if placed deliberately. The tarps were secured with heavy-duty tape, layered again and again. Whoever buried them had taken their time. Dental records confirmed what the McCarthy family had feared, and somehow known, the moment authorities called them in. Rachel and Alexa had never been lost. They had been hidden. Autopsies revealed multiple stab wounds on both victims. The injuries were consistent, methodical. There were no defensive wounds on Rachel's hands, suggesting she may have been restrained. Alexa showed signs of a brief struggle, but it had ended quickly. The medical examiner concluded both women died within hours of their disappearance in June 2010. For 3 years, they had been beneath that floor. As news spread, public outrage exploded. Questions poured in. How could 2 bodies remain hidden so close to the park for so long? How had no one noticed? Investigators turned their attention to the gas station's history. The property had been owned and operated by a man named Caleb Rourke, a quiet, middle-aged mechanic who ran the station until it closed in late 2010. Locals described him as helpful, the kind of person who gave stranded drivers directions or let hikers use the phone. He had sold the property shortly after the sisters vanished. Rourke was brought in for questioning the same day the bodies were identified. At first, he denied everything. Claimed he barely remembered the sisters. Said the garage had been accessible to anyone after the station closed. But as detectives laid out timelines, inconsistencies surfaced. Rourke had been working alone the day Rachel and Alexa disappeared. His phone records placed him near the park exit that afternoon. And witnesses now recalled seeing 2 women enter his garage, believing he was helping them. What stunned investigators most was what came next. When pressed about the items found in the park, the scarf, the boot, the map fragment, Rourke didn't react with confusion. He reacted with recognition. And in that moment, detectives realized something chilling. The evidence that had kept the case alive for years had never been lost. It had been placed. Caleb Rourke asked for water before the questioning began. He sat alone in the interview room, hands folded neatly in front of him, eyes fixed on the scuffed surface of the table. He looked like exactly what he had always been described as ordinary. Mid-50s. Thinning hair. A faint grease stain still visible beneath one fingernail. The kind of man you wouldn't remember passing on the street. That was what unsettled detectives the most. They had interviewed monsters before. People who radiated volatility or arrogance. Rourke showed neither. He spoke softly. He answered questions slowly, as if choosing each word with care. At first, he told a familiar story. He said he'd seen the sisters briefly that afternoon. They'd pulled into his station asking for directions back toward the park. He'd pointed them toward the highway. That was it. He hadn't seen them again. Detectives let him talk. They showed him photos of the items recovered in the mountains, the scarf, the boot, the map fragment. Rourke studied them longer than necessary. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed. "You recognize these?" an investigator asked. Rourke nodded once. He said he remembered the scarf because one of the women had been wearing it when they arrived. Said the boot must have come loose while they were walking. The lie was immediate and obvious. None of the items had been reported missing at the time. No one outside law enforcement had known they existed. The room fell silent. For the first time, Rourke looked up. What followed was not a sudden confession. It was a slow unraveling. Investigators confronted him with timelines. Phone pings. A receipt from a nearby hardware store showing he'd purchased heavy-duty plastic tarps 2 days after the sisters disappeared. Surveillance footage from a different gas station showed his car driving toward the park late that night, then returning hours later. Rourke's shoulders sagged. He asked how long the sisters had been missing. When told it had been nearly 3 years, he closed his eyes. "They were never supposed to be found," he said. The confession came in pieces. Rourke admitted he'd approached Rachel and Alexa just outside the park, offering help when he saw them studying a map. He told them a shortcut back to their trailhead had been closed due to maintenance and offered to show them an alternate route from his garage, where he kept old maps. They trusted him. Inside the garage, he locked the door. What happened next was methodical, not frenzied. Rourke had done this before. He admitted as much. The sisters were not his first victims. After killing them, he wrapped their bodies in tarps and buried them beneath the garage floor, pouring fresh concrete to seal the space. Over the following months, he returned to the park repeatedly, planting their belongings along trails and ravines to reinforce the narrative he wanted investigators to believe. That they had been lost. That the mountains were to blame. When detectives asked why he did it, Rourke offered no grand explanation. No childhood trauma. No moment of rage. "I liked being helpful," he said quietly. "People trusted me." The scope of his crimes expanded as investigators dug deeper. Cold cases from neighboring counties began to align. Other missing hikers. Drifters last seen asking for directions. A woman whose car had broken down near Rourke's station years earlier. 5 victims in total were eventually linked to him. At trial, the courtroom was packed. Rachel and Alexa's parents sat in the front row every day, listening as the details they'd been spared for years were finally spoken aloud. Photos of the garage were shown. Diagrams of the burial site. testimony from workers who had unknowingly stood atop the concrete floor beneath which the sisters lay. The defense argued that Rourke's confession had been coerced. That evidence had been circumstantial. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Caleb Rourke was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no reaction when the verdict was read. No outburst. No tears. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he had always expected. For the McCarthy family, the verdict brought a form of closure, but not peace. They learned how close the sisters had been to help. How they'd trusted the wrong person. How their case had been steered away from the truth for years by a man who had stood just outside the search perimeter, watching others chase the story he had written for them. The mountains, once a place of joy, became something else entirely. And the gas station, demolished and rebuilt, became a landmark locals avoided, even after the trial ended. Because everyone who knew the story understood one thing. The danger hadn't been hidden in the wilderness. It had been waiting right beside the road. In the months after Caleb Rourke was sentenced, investigators revisited the McCarthy case one final time, not to reopen wounds, but to understand how it had gone wrong. The official review was quiet. No press conferences. No public apologies. Just a series of internal meetings where maps were unrolled again and timelines were traced with fingers that had done this once before, years earlier. This time, they followed the road instead of the trail. It became clear how easily the investigation had been misdirected. Every planted item Rourke left behind had reinforced what search teams already believed, that the sisters were somewhere in the mountains, injured or lost. Each discovery reset the clock, justified new searches, and pushed attention farther into the wilderness. No one thought to look down at the highway long enough. One retired detective admitted later that the case haunted him not because it was unsolved, but because it had been solved incorrectly for so long. Rourke had inserted himself into the investigation early. Records showed he'd spoken to officers within the first week, offering to print missing posters at his station and letting volunteers use his restroom. He'd given directions to search teams. He'd nodded sympathetically when Rachel and Alexa's parents spoke on television. He had never raised suspicion because he fit too well. The review also explained how the case resurfaced nearly 10 years after the sisters vanished, a detail that puzzled the public long after the verdict. In 2019, long after Rourke's conviction, a new cold case unit began digitizing evidence from older investigations. During that process, an analyst noticed a pattern across multiple missing person cases near the park. Items recovered months or years later, always clean, always placed just far enough off the main trails to be found. The same gas station appeared in several reports, not as a crime scene, but as a location where witnesses said victims had asked for help. That discovery didn't change the outcome of Rachel and Alexa's case. But it confirmed what many had quietly suspected. Rourke hadn't been lucky. He'd been intentional. For the McCarthy family, the years that followed were about rebuilding something that could never return to normal. They moved out of state. Sold the house where the sisters had grown up. Their mother donated Rachel and Alexa's hiking gear to a non-profit that trained search and rescue volunteers, unable to keep the items but unwilling to discard them. Every June, they returned to the Smokies. Not to hike. Just to stand at the trailhead where everything began. They placed 2 small plaques near the parking lot. Simple, unobtrusive. No mention of violence. Just names. Dates. And a reminder to check in with someone before heading into the backcountry. The park, too, changed. Rangers updated protocols. Visitors were warned not to accept directions or assistance from unofficial sources. Emergency call boxes were added near major exits. Training now included scenarios that assumed the threat might come after a hike ended, not during it. Still, some questions never found answers. How many times had Rachel and Alexa passed Rourke Station on previous trips without noticing him? How many people had spoken to him over the years and walked away unharmed, never knowing how close they'd come? Those questions lived in the quiet spaces between facts, where true crime stories linger long after the credits roll. Today, drivers pass the rebuilt gas station without realizing what once lay beneath its floor. There's no sign, no marker, just clean concrete and fluorescent lights. And yet, for those who know the story, the ground there feels different. Heavier. Because the truth of the McCarthy sisters' disappearance wasn't hidden in some unreachable place. It was buried where no one thought to look. And the most chilling part isn't that the sisters vanished on a hike. It's that they trusted someone who offered help, and the world spent years searching in the wrong direction. Cases like this force us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many disappearances are truly accidents, and how many are carefully staged to look that way? If Rachel and Alexa's story teaches us anything, it's that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, gives directions, and waits. What do you think? Could this case have been solved sooner, or was it always destined to remain hidden until the ground itself gave up the truth? If this story stayed with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe the missing deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing, because some stories refuse to stay buried.